We'll start off today. To get us started, I'll introduce myself. My name is Rennie Beeman, and I work as a counselor with Alzheimer Group, or AGI. For those of you who may not know, at AGI, we provide support to people living with dementia and their caregivers. I'm pleased to have a few other members of our team here today along with me. And this free lecture today has been made possible by the generous support of the Lindsay Memorial Foundation. AGI is a charitable organization and we rely on the support of donations. So you're welcome to make a donation at any time and you'll be receiving a link for that via email later today. I am very excited to welcome our guest speaker today, Dr. Tamara Sussman. She is an associate professor in the School of Social Work at McGill, and one of her areas of expertise in both practice and research has been working with people with dementia and their family members. I will pass this over to Dr. Sussman in just a moment. This lecture will be about an hour, and we will have time at the end for Dr. Sussman to take questions from the audience. I'll ask that you please submit your questions via the chat box that's in the bottom right corner of your screen. You can submit questions at any point throughout the lecture, and when we get to the end, I'll be reading them out loud. If you do submit a question in the chat, we'd appreciate, if you're comfortable, if you can tell us your name and what brings you here. So for instance, if you are a caregiver for somebody in your family or you're a professional caregiver, etc. So without further ado, thank you, Dr. Sussman, for being here today, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Great, thanks, Rennie. Hi, everyone. Like many of you, I am just getting used to this new way of communicating. So my usual tricks, like looking at the audience and making eye contact with people, aren't quite as available to me. So hopefully everything that I say today, we will have a little bit of an opportunity to do some exchange, as Rennie said, through either the chat or through some questions, because I think that things come a bit more alive when we have a bit of a chance to interact. So I was asked to talk to you a little bit about caring for people with dementia in this new context of COVID-19. Of course, it's a complicated time for everybody, and I don't think we have been hearing enough about the work that you do as caregivers, and it really is essential work. You family caregivers are the backbone of our healthcare system. We saw when families were pulled out of long-term care, the collapse of that system, and part of it is because families do so much. It's sad that we haven't heard enough about what family caregivers are also doing at home and in the community, because you're also providing absolutely essential support. And we wouldn't have people with dementia living in the community so well and living in nursing homes so well without the work that you do. So when I'm out on my porch banging my pots for the frontline workers, I'm authentically not just thinking about the nurses and the doctors that we've heard so much about. I really am thinking about all of you who are doing the work that you're doing to keep your family members well. But of course, all of that does not come without a cost. So I just want to remind all of you, because when you're in the job of caring for somebody, sometimes you forget all of the different things you do and that you were doing before any of this hit us. So what were some of the things you were already faced with as family caregivers or friend caregivers? Of course, many people think of caregiving as tangible support, helping somebody get somewhere, helping somebody with the bath, helping somebody get dressed. And a lot of family members who may not be doing that tangible support will even say, I'm not sure I'm a caregiver, I'm just a spouse supporting my relative or a family member. But actually, to me, the work of caregiving is so much more about the less visible things that you do. Particularly in the area of dementia, you are not only coping with the losses that you're experiencing as you see the person that you're supporting not able to do some of the things they were once able to do. You also often spend a lot of time helping them or protecting them from their loss by taking on things kind of quietly so that they don't feel so disarmed. You know, I've heard stories of family members say, I don't feel comfortable driving. I never have, but I'd rather drive now than have my spouse get their driver's license taken away. So I'm just taking that on. And you do that all the time. You're protecting the person that you're supporting all the time in so many ways. It takes a lot of additional emotional energy. In addition, you're dealing with anticipatory grief. You're dealing with, I'm in the moment, I'm doing the best I can, I'm really thankful for all the things that we're still able to do. But then you're also worried and thinking about what the future might be and some of the other losses that you might experience. Maybe the travel to Florida can't happen anymore, or you're worried this could be the last year that happens. So you're constantly you're dealing with in the moment losses, and you're thinking about some of the future losses and emotionally processing those experiences. I think one of the biggest things you do as well is you make the person that you're supporting visible to the rest of us. You are the conduit of the personalized information that ensures that when a doctor talks to you, you're making your family member feel supported. You're reminding them of some of the things that your family member still can do. You're making their personhood kind of visible to everybody else. I'm sure that you've experienced many a time people kind of talking to you instead of talking to your relative, and you spend a lot of time kind of navigating, ensuring that they're still included in the way that they can be included. And that also takes a lot of energy. You're also coordinating the care. When the doctor's appointments are, when, we're supposed to see the podiatrist, when the day program is. I mean, keeping a map of all that, coordinating all that is a huge responsibility. And many of you are probably also doing that in your own lives. If you have other family members, if you're caring for a parent and you're coordinating your own family, and then you're coordinating your family's family. So, and not to be minimized as well is the decision-making component of what you do, especially as your relative or your friend who you're supporting loses some capacity. You take on a lot more decisions. Should we go for the day program even if my relative doesn't want it? Is it the time to insist we have home care even if I know my relative isn't sure they want it? Those decisions are really, really burdensome, and to have to take that on, not just for yourself, but on behalf of somebody else, can be extremely exhausting. So undoubtedly, before the world changed, these impacts, whether it's the sadness periodically, the anger and the frustration, the isolation of dealing with the rest of the world seemingly operating in a relatively normal way, and you having all of this other demands on you, the stress, the worry about the future, all of these things were things that you have been living with and grappling with, for some of you, for many years. And then we were faced with COVID, and the world changed, and whatever was already piled onto you just got exacerbated. So some of the additional complications that many of you are now dealing with, you're managing your own grief around the world as we once knew it. Or maybe some of you lost jobs. Maybe some of you are now working in a different context. There's financial implications for people, but you're also managing your relatives' grief. And deciding how much you're telling them about what's happening in the world. So how you're framing COVID and what it means. No matter which way you've chosen, your relative's own anxiety may be coming out in more behavioral challenges, in more anxiety than you've had before. So you're dealing with your own anxiety, and now you're dealing with your relative or friend's anxiety, the person who you're caring for. And to add salt to the wound, you've also probably seen a myriad of directives on how family caregivers can oversee the health and well-being of a person with dementia. Because, as I'm sure you have all figured out, it's not easy to socially distance yourself, but to manage somebody else's social distance when they may not understand in the same way how to do that, why they're doing that, to manage your own hygiene and hand washing and somebody else's, to get somebody to wear a mask who doesn't understand why they're doing that. All of these things just add a layer of burden. It's enough for any one of us to be managing ourselves, but you're really managing yourself and somebody else. Of course, the tangible support you've been providing could have increased. Some of you might have been faced with the fact that either it didn't feel safe for home care to come in anymore, or maybe you've elected not to have somebody come into the home just because we're worried about disease and infection. So that's really up the ante on getting groceries, maybe doing personal care that you hadn't done before. So the tangible support is really, really increased. And of course, like the rest of us, we're all learning new skills. All of a sudden we got to figure out telehealth. We've got to figure out Zoom, maybe FaceTime. And these things are very real for you, because if you're going to check in with your health provider and you're going to ask information, you have to figure this stuff out. Otherwise, you're going to be completely isolated. I know in my world, I just took about 7 headshots of my daughter's teeth, because apparently that's the new way to get the orthodontist to do an exam. So all of these things take time, they're stressful, and when you've already got that layer that you're dealing with, it can be very discombobulating. And of course, I kind of alluded to this, the decisions and problem solving that you're now doing. Like, how much do I manage the problem solving? Do I fight about the mask, or do I let it go because it's causing too much distress? Should I be letting home care in? Is it safe to do so, or shouldn't I? How do I explain COVID to my relative with maybe more severe dementia? What words do I use? All of these things are just added layers of responsibility that you're managing during this period of time. So what are the impacts? Well, they're pretty much the same as what you've already been dealing with, except bigger, right? More sadness, more frustration. The only sort of silver lining that I have heard from some caregivers, it's not going to be everybody's experience, but often you've operated in such a world of isolation where it feels like everybody gets to do whatever they want and you're stuck, not being able to take advantage of certain things. And for some caregivers, the world stopping a little bit has kind of even the playing field in a way, and felt a little bit less isolating. That's not for everybody, but because, not everybody's running around in the same way that they did. But of course, stress, worry, all of these things are just still there and even more accentuated. So what kind of strategies can you use and to manage the impacts? All of us are thinking about this. All of us are wondering, how do we stay healthy? How do we take care of ourselves so that we can continue supporting and caring for the people that we're responsible for? And I'm sure that you have heard time and time again the importance of staying connected. And I think that it's really important more than ever, despite everything that you are being demanded to do to ensure that you stay connected with your family and friends. And that is not just updating people on what you need and what you're doing and the work, but, having a laugh, having a cry, feeling connected with others, whether that's through porch visits, the phone, FaceTime, Zoom, whatever it is that you're doing. And in some of your cases, it is also a time that you might be able to leverage and find a new opportunity for connecting with the person with dementia who you're supporting by doing some activities together, by reminiscing together, by doing exercise together, massage. Human touch and connection is so important for all of us. And it may also be a time where you have a little bit more opportunity to connect with the person who you've been supporting because you're running around a little bit less. Connecting to your emotional reactions, I think, is also incredibly important. One technique that I have tried myself, and I'm not really a journaling kind of person, but one kind of technique is journaling. And one very simple thing that you can do if you're just kind of bothered, like you don't even know what's bothering you, you're just feeling in a state of high emotion. Sit down and answer the question, what's bothering me? Just write it all down. Take as much time as you want. Just, don't edit, don't think about it. And then look at all of the words and narrow it down to about 50. This technique is actually called the 50 to 55 word poem. And it's a way of getting at what's really bothering you, getting all the superfluous kind of words out and really honing in on what's actually bothering you. And it can be quite effective. So given that we're in a world of trying new things, something else to think about. But, to manage the grief and the loss that you're experiencing, that you've already been experiencing, and that you're experiencing more so in this new world, and to manage the social isolation, these kinds of staying connected techniques can be rather helpful. Planning ahead can be quite helpful, particularly around that additional state of anxiety and worry that you've got. Now, some of you may have already thought through many of these things because I think we're into 10 weeks of the incidence of COVID. But of course, as a caregiver, you're thinking about what would happen if I get COVID? What would happen to my relative? So if you're sitting with that worry and you haven't already made that plan, talking to people and figuring out what a contingency plan for you would be really, really helpful. Making a list of key people and key names and key numbers to contact in the event something happens to you. And even putting down your daily routine, the things that the person you're caring for needs to have happen on a daily basis in the event that you're out of the picture. Packing a hospital bag is something else that some people have done for themselves, for their relative with dementia. We're all hoping for the best. It's really important for us not to get fixated on fear, but at the same time, for you particularly, because you have so many worries about what could possibly happen if something happened to you or something happened to your relative, having some of these plans can be very reassuring just in your back pocket. Advanced care planning is an area of practice that I've done a lot, personally done a lot of research in. And the process of advanced care planning is about talking about the kind of future care you would want should you get sick and should things take a turn for the worse. In the area of COVID, some of the decisions all of us have to make, if we were to get COVID and we were to get quite sick and start having respiratory illness, would we want a ventilator, and under what circumstances? Would we want our relative to have a ventilator, and under what circumstances? Would we want ICU care, and under what circumstances? Would we want that for our relative? You've also got the added worry about what happens if my relative with dementia gets sick and gets hospitalized and I'm told I can't go in. How anxious are they going to be? So another thing to figure out is what would happen. Are hospitals is your local hospital letting families in under these circumstances? Finding out in advance what hospitalization could look like should that emerge as a reality for you is really important. And I think what's complicated is when you're asked to make these decisions in the moment of a crisis. So I know that some of you who have relatives in long-term care homes may have already gotten phone calls in a panic from the long-term care home. Listen, if your relative gets sick, what do you want us to do? It's really difficult to make those kinds of decisions when you're in a crisis mode of actually facing them. And it's a little bit easier to think about these things in advance. So at the end of the talk, I do have a link to a few resources for those of you who are interested that can help you think through some of the questions you might reflect upon for yourself. And I will say in the area of advanced care planning, this is something actually we should all be doing. This isn't about you as a caregiver particularly have this responsibility. All of us should actually be engaging in these conversations. I've already had these conversations with my partner and my father. And I think that they're something we should all be engaging in anyway, despite COVID. Information, of course, is your best friend and your worst enemy, because we're all inundated with so much information, and too much information can be traumatizing. So on the one hand, you have to control and manage how much you're allowing yourself to keep track and read. And one strategy around that is to maybe find one or two sites that you consider to be particularly useful in terms of keeping yourself updated. And once again, I've put a link at the end on a site that has quite interesting information, particularly for caregivers of persons with dementia. But information is also your best friend because it helps you make good decisions. So of course, information about, we've all been told what to look for in ourselves should we start to experience symptoms. What does potential symptoms look like for a person with dementia? There's been some recommendations around that. One of the things that I've read, which I guess is no surprise because it comes up with many viruses, is that you might see more confusion at a very sort of accelerated rate before you see some of the other symptoms that we're more accustomed to thinking about, like the cough and the temperature, breathing issues. So there's some good information on that just to have in your backhand. Many of you have, I've already alluded to this, but many of you have already had to make decisions around the risks and benefits of allowing, if you've been offered, because I know some of you, some of the programs and resources you normally had have been taken away because they've been closed for now, and maybe it's not considered essential. But if you've been offered home supports, should you allow somebody in? If you do, what are some of the best safety practices? And there are some directives for family caregivers around people are coming into your home. It's okay to ask them if they've had symptoms. It's okay to ask that their temperature is checked, even if they don't regularly do this. It's okay to ensure that there's masks and there's cleaning supplies. So first, you might find out what the kind of protocols and standard practices is with the home care environments, but it's also okay to impose your own rules and regulations around safety in your own home. And there are some sites that offer a bit more information about this. Of course, if you've got a relative in housing, whether we've heard, we're all inundated with what's going on in long-term care, CHSLDs, in nursing homes. But many or some of you might have relatives in other forms of housing who've gotten protocols like you're no longer allowed in to visit, or they're no longer allowed out. Finding out what their protocols are for managing spread, what their safety regulations are. What would happen if your relative was really sick? Would you be allowed in to get them, to take them somewhere? I mean, finding out these rules and regulations are really helpful so that you know how to make proper decisions for yourself. And as I mentioned, this balanced with avoiding overexposure. I don't know if you are already, if any of you have already had the symptom of just really being so hyperly vigilant that you're having trouble sleeping. I had that a few weeks ago, and I kind of realized I was watching the news every night before I went to bed. Of course, it's headline after headline of disaster, and it was really impacting me. So I decided that I'm not watching the news every night before I go to bed. I catch up on 1 or 2 special sites for myself, and I found it a little bit of an easier way to manage. So you're dealing with it for yourself. You're also noticing your family member with dementia who might hear something, and for them, that anxiety reaches through the roof. So really, I can't impart enough how the balance between getting yourself informed but not overexposing yourself to traumatic information is really critical. Things to watch out for. I think the other thing that we all need to be doing is to check in with ourselves around, are we okay? It's really, really hard, especially when you're a caregiver and you're caring for somebody else, to see yourself as in need of support, or even have a right to support, or the luxury of time to worry about yourself. But the earlier you notice that your worry is turning into maybe a more generalized anxiety, or that your sadness is maybe turning into more of a baseline depression, that your stress is moving into an area where burnout could be there and be there to stay, the earlier you notice those things and the quicker you reach out for help, the easier it is to get yourself back to baseline. So a few things that I would just suggest watching out for in yourselves is, of course, as a caregiver, irritability is natural. You're going to lose it. You're not always going to say it in the way that you wish you would have. But if your level of irritability is kind of consistently a lot more elevated, and some of your usual strategies or even some new strategies that you're trying don't seem to help, you can't seem to get yourself sort of more in a bit of a calmer place, that might be something to watch out for around burnout. If your feelings of hopelessness and helplessness, are there, and they're there consistently, and they don't seem to kind of go in ebbs and flows, because once again, you're dealing with grief. So of course you're going to feel hopeless, and of course you're going to feel helpless sometimes. But if there is a steady sense of that, and you don't see that kind of ebbing and flowing up and down over the course of the day or a week, that might be something that tells you to reach out, express your feelings a bit, watch out for potential depression. Chronic lethargy and lack of interest. This is something that all of us are struggling with a little bit. But if you're really, we've all been told we should act as if, we got ourselves into a routine, we should be getting dressed. Most of us do that some of the time and not all of the time. If you're really having trouble getting yourself going, your usual routines are kind of out the window. The day program you might have used is no longer around. You don't have to run around, getting everybody up and dressed in the same way that you once did. But if you're really having trouble motivating yourself and maintaining an interest, that's something else. That's something else to think about and to notice in yourself. And finally, worry. Worry as a caregiver is kind of your MO. That is because much of the time you are thinking about and anticipating the future. I spoke about anticipatory grief. I spoke about all of the things that you have to think about around making decisions, not just now, but also in the future. So worry is a big part of your lives as caregivers. If that worry doesn't get dissipated once you identify, okay, what am I worrying about, and planning ahead, those strategies aren't helping. That's another thing to think about and another reason to reach out. And of course, just by coming to this lecture, all of you know about AGI as one resource, and that's one place that you could start with in terms of reaching out. Many of you also, I'm sure, know as citizens of Quebec that the 811 number that's available to all of us around COVID does also have psychosocial support kind of component where you can be told what some of the resources are that are available to you. And of course, there is the self-care. This somehow seems to be the biggest allergy for caregivers because you're so used to caring for other people. And it's almost, for some of you, maybe even irritating to be told that you need to take care of yourself, because you're kind of looking at people going, well, that's a luxury that I don't have. But of course, in this time, and especially in this time of COVID, when there's so much stress and there's so much additional grief that we're all dealing with, it is imperative that you keep yourself well, not just for yourself, but for the relative who is relying on you to make good decisions for them. If you're in a state of worry, if you're in a state of irritability, you're not going to be in a position to make good decisions for your relative, nor for yourself. So I think the very least should be to find one time in the day where you get a break, and that break could look like having a cup of coffee without interruption. By locking yourself in a bathroom. Respite isn't just about, leaving. It's about sort of emotionally leaving a situation. So something that you really enjoy doing, ensure that you find a way to have that, that you are able to do that. Of course, eating well and exercising is really important, as is sleep. And these are the things that you can do if you're living with a person with dementia that you're supporting. These are the things that you guys can do together, that you can, do a little bit of an exercise routine together, or, do some meal prep together if the person who you're supporting is capable of doing that, just to keep yourselves both well. And of course, sleep to the best of your abilities, going to bed at the same time, and ensuring that you try to get a good amount of sleep, because all of these things will accumulate. And I do realize that as I say these things, once again, these are the first things off the table for most caregivers. And now in this period of additional world stress, even harder to do, but probably also most important to do, because of all of the different stressors that you are now dealing with on top of everything you were dealing with before COVID even struck. So finally, I want to say a word about grief. All of us are grieving. We're all dealing with the loss of the world as we knew it, and none of us know what the new reality that we're all being told is coming our way is going to look like. So in our own ways, all of us are dealing with sadness and loss in some way of what we took for granted before. And of course, grief elicits feelings of distress and feelings of sadness, but it does also offer an opportunity for growth and change. So if we find a way to accept some of the things we cannot change and deal and allow ourselves to sit with the emotions and the thoughts that go with our loss. And that's why I was saying that, you know, as a caregiver, connecting with others or journaling and allowing yourself to feel those feelings and express those thoughts, we can also find a way of making adjustments both in ourselves, in our relationships, and hopefully in our world that allow for things to be different. I mean, one of the things that I hope for is that amidst all the tragedy in CHSLDs, finally there might be a wake up that this aspect of our healthcare system has been seriously underfunded for decades. I would like to see the same conversation in our home care system, because that's where many of you, if you're still caring for your family members at home, are really coping with the brunt of a very, very reduced system already. And if grief can elicit change and adjustment, my hope is that we all speak out a bit more around some of the things that we've been managing and that you've been managing for many years, and demand something to be different as a consequence of that. So as I suggested to you, I did put the link, and I think, Rennie, you're going to be sending this out to others. I did put a link. One of them is a link to a bunch of resources that are specific for dementia caregiving that I think are particularly helpful, that you can get updated information. And the other is a link to some advanced care planning material that I kind of alluded to earlier that's specifically adapted for COVID that you might find useful and interesting, just to think about what you should be thinking about if you haven't already. So thank you very much for the opportunity to talk, and I will turn it to you, Rennie. I think you might have some questions for me.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sussman, for sharing with us today. I just want to note, if you haven't already sent in a question, but you have one, please feel free to share it in the chat box that we have. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button that says chat. And if you click on that, you can access the chat window for everybody in the audience, and you can type in your questions there. Again, feel free to share your name and what's bringing you here today. I'll get started with a few of the questions that we received throughout while you were speaking, Dr. Sussman. The first one comes from David. David is telling us that his mother is 75 years old and she has Alzheimer's, and his father is 84 and is her primary caregiver.
Yeah.
And David is saying, referring to his father, that he is making decisions that are not always safe for my mother. He takes his role very seriously and is overly protective, while at the same time not making safe decisions for her. And when we critique or suggest changes, he gets very upset.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a huge stress. I think that it is as hard as it was before. It's even harder now. I don't know if you're feeling like you can even have contact with your parents, or now you're dealing with things over the phone and you're being given reports and you're trying to kind of offer up suggestions. I mean, I would kind of look at some of the information. I don't know what the risks are that you're talking about, but I would look at some of the information on the website that I clicked just around safety, because it's not, we get ourselves really, really up in arms, of course, because we're told to, and because it's important that, we shouldn't be going out, and we should be social distancing, and we must be wearing masks, and we have to be washing our hands. And all of those things are really important. But you also have to balance that a bit with sanity and quality of life and how many fights you're going to get into. So I think there is something to be said for at least putting a pros and con risks and benefits for what's the worst risk and what are the consequences of addressing it. And allow yourself the freedom not to be perfect. We were taking risks before COVID began. I think this is really important because all of you could probably get into tense conversations 15 times a day with your relative. They keep on wanting to go out, maybe. They keep on fighting with you about a mask. You have to allow yourself some space for error too. So I would encourage you to get the information, which you probably already have, but I would also encourage you to ask yourself about the pros and cons of insisting on certain things in this context, and sometimes even letting certain things go, because it's impossible to control everybody's behavior, and sometimes the cost is worse than the cost of allowing for imperfect social distancing all the time, as an example, right? The only other thing that I will say is it might help if this is about taking risks around exposure and you're concerned about the health of your older relatives. You might look at some of the advanced care planning materials just around, what COVID looks like and what some of the decisions that you might have to make should you face getting infected. And that might help sort of activate a more transparent conversation.
So thank you, Dr. Sussman. We have another question that came in from Elaine. Elaine cares for her 92-year-old mother who is living alone in an apartment.
Yeah.
She says that all support workers have stopped coming to her mother. Elaine says, my question will be about the problem of the extended exposure to the person with dementia or Alzheimer's. I find myself disturbed by the overt signs of dementia. She gives examples of lip smacking, tongue darting, and not changing clothing, much more than before. Elaine says, I feel guilty about the annoyance and losing patience.
Yeah. Well, that's the join the club. I mean, you are under so much stress. We're all under so much stress. So to expect of yourself to have as much patience as you might have had before is unrealistic. You were probably already irritated, and now you're probably more irritated. I mean, that is something. Get rid of the guilt and ask yourself, okay, if I want an interaction that's as positive as possible, what can I tolerate? Maybe I can tolerate a 5-minute or 10-minute check-in visit and focus on the positive and leave it at that, and not stay for the 30 minutes where I get more irritable. So ask yourself, first of all, accept the fact that it is okay to feel frustrated and irritated. You've got this huge responsibility. If you've lost all of the supports of people coming in, it's now more on your plate. You've been stuck with more responsibility. You're invisible. No one's talking about the work that you're doing anywhere. And it's difficult to be patient all the time. So I would suggest find, whether it's a time in the day or what your tolerance level is, and allow yourself to have a few visits where you can actually feel more positive about them, even if there's less of them, or even if they're shorter. That's what I would at least try.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sussman. We have another question, somewhat similar. This question is coming from Joanne. She says, I'm the main caregiver for my father, who's 77 and in the mid stages of Alzheimer's. He lives autonomously in a private residence. Joanne is saying she has not seen him since March 8th. She says, but I am managing everything by daily phone calls and collaboration from the management at the residence. She says, I'm allowed to go see him now, but I'm not comfortable going into the residence right now.
Yeah.
My father is not asking for me to come or in any distress, and he's stable. And Joanne's question is, am I causing any mental and emotional damage for my father by not going to see him? She asks, as an option, she could go to see him outdoors, but she's concerned that he'll then expect her to go into his apartment and understand wearing a mask and staying 2 meters apart.
Yeah.
So Joanne's saying she's feeling like it might be better to keep things status quo, and she's wondering what you think about that.
Yeah, I think this is where the adage, when you care for yourself, you're a better caregiver, comes into play. You have to listen to your real concern about exposure and do what's comfortable. And it sounds like the phone calls are helpful. You've got somebody in the building monitoring, so you can be more vigilant with the questions that you ask the management in the building around how your dad's looking and how his hygiene is, or does he seem calm. You can ask some of the things that are in your worst nightmare that you're worried about. But it sounds to me like he's satisfied with the phone calls. It's possible that the next time you see him, many family members experienced this when they were finally allowed back into long-term care. And there's a little shock that he doesn't quite look exactly the way he looked before. But I think in terms of his mental well-being, it sounds like he's satisfied with the reassurance that you're giving him. The only other thing you could add, I don't know if it's a possibility with the management, but if you were to get if you feel that it would reassure you to get a visual sort of FaceTime of your dad or something like that, and the management can help facilitate that, that might be another way of reassuring yourself. But these are certainly the tough decisions that caregivers are faced with making in this circumstance. I will just add, this is for all of you to think about when you're making these decisions. You know, would your dad, if he was well and able and capable, want you to risk yourself for him in another world? You know, or would he not? You all know what your relationships are like with your family members. Sometimes also reminding yourself of, if your dad was in, you know, in a different state or was as he was before, how would he feel about this? You know, that's another thing to ask yourself.
Thank you. We have a question here coming from Sandra. Sandra shared with us that she took care of her mother between 2006 and 2015. And it seems she works as a professional caregiver now. And she's asking, how do I manage as a caregiver going back into my client's home? For what I understand, Sandra's asking about safety techniques and concerns, like if she's okay and her client is okay, as far as they know, what are protocols about wearing masks, whatever information you're able to share on that.
Yeah, so this is where I think that the website that I linked you to will be quite helpful. What I find very frustrating in our world of right now is we're learning a lot about safety measures in long-term care and in hospitals, and that hasn't transferred in the same way into the community. So to me, wearing masks, wearing gloves that get taken that get put on when you're in and taken off and disposed of, like, disposable gloves. If you wear gloves the whole time, it's basically like it becomes your hand. But wearing masks, wearing gloves, doing the simple screen. When a family member goes into long-term care, they're asked, have you had a fever? Have you been exposed to anybody with COVID? So in reverse, you can kind of, if a person is capable, depends, you can kind of ask around symptoms. You can have a temperature taken. You can take your own temperature, and ensure that hand sanitizer is there. All of these things that are actually the protocols in institutions can and should be things, I think, that should be more readily available in the community. Your organization, if you're going in on your own as someone working for yourself, that's one thing. If you have an organization that you're a part of, asking and questioning how you're going to be protected is really, really critical and important. What are the protocols of the organization? So all of us, all of you, whether you're a family member or a paid member, have a right to protection in the midst of your caregiving, and insisting, even if it's not offered to you, on certain protections, I think is absolutely within your right. And I think you'll find this website helpful around some of those safety measures.
Thank you. I'm just seeing a couple follow-up questions here. So this is from Elaine, who asked a question earlier about feeling a lot of increased exposure to the person that she's taking care of. She's asking that, she's wondering if you think that annoyance and frustration that a lot of people may be feeling now are emotions that help deflect worrying about the big picture. The big picture, she's saying, being the sad eventuality that we know our loved one is heading towards.
Absolutely. I mean, anger often, anger can be anger because there's a lot to be angry about. And anger can also be a mask for sadness and loss. And it's incredibly, this is where I said it at the beginning, your grieving and management of loss has been constant as family caregivers. And you're constantly seeing change. Maybe some of you are seeing more change because you're seeing your relative more often. You're managing that sadness and absolutely getting irritated with them, or getting irritated about something can somehow, allow you to distract yourself. So this is where, with grief and sadness, it's important to find a balance between allowing yourself to feel your feelings and really identify where those things are coming from and what you're irritated by, what you're sad about, but also problem solve and focus and deflect and distract yourself. It's really important to find a nice balance between those two things. Yeah.
Thank you. We had a question a little while ago. Irene is wondering about any news regarding government permission to visit long-term care homes. Kind of like, what's the latest on that?
So this is where a directive and the implementation of the directive can break down. So the government has issued a permission to allow family members who have played a key role in support before COVID to come in to a long-term care home in Quebec. But it has left it up to the home to decide how they're going to implement that and if they have the capacity to support that. So it seems to me that there is a gamut of different responses, and some family members are not finding it easy, or they've still been told that they're not allowed to go in yet. This might be because the organization doesn't have the protective gear to support you. But in my read of the directive, a family member who has been a present person before COVID has a right to go in and see their relative right now. You also have a right to the protective gear that staff get, to the training of that protective gear, and to understand how the home's structured. Some homes now have, hot zones where they have people who have COVID and uninfected people in different places, and sort of understanding how the home has responded is helpful for you in making the decision. So sadly, there's not been more very specific directives coming from the government, which would have made it, I think, more impossible for different organizations to kind of choose their own way of interpreting things.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Sussman. I'm just keeping an eye on our time here, and I think that's all the time that we have today for questions. I'm sorry if we weren't able to read your question aloud from the chat, but I want to encourage everybody to please continue to be in touch with AGI. If you have a question that we weren't able to address in today's lecture, feel free to write us an email or give us a call, and one of our counselors will be happy to get back to you about that and speak to you about your question and support you in whatever that you're looking for. I'd like to say thank you very much to Dr. Sussman on behalf of all of us at AGI for sharing your time and expertise with us today. Before you go, everyone, I just want to note that we'll be sending out an email this afternoon with a survey about today's lecture. We would really appreciate your feedback because it can help us develop and improve future events like this. We will also be sending out a video recording of today's lecture via our YouTube channel, as well as Dr. Sussman's slides. So the resources that you're seeing on your screen right now will be accessible to you. And again, I'd really encourage each of you to please continue to be in touch with us at AGI. We're here for support, especially during these unprecedented times. Feel free to reach out by phone or by email again, and a counselor can connect with you. So I'd like to say thank you to everybody for joining us today. I'm not sure, Dr. Sussman, do you have anything final to add?
No, I mean, I just, will add these very, these scenarios that people have posed, I think are the perfect examples of the very real decisions and problem solving that you're facing as a consequence of COVID. And they're exhausting. They're exhausting to be so worried about not just yourself, but somebody else making the right decision. So I just want to acknowledge that it's important to acknowledge how much the weight of the decision making is on your shoulders in this time when no one really knows exactly what to do.
Thank you. I think that's really important for all of us to hear. So thank you, everyone. Again, keep an eye on your emails this afternoon, and we hope to continue to be in touch with you.
Thank you.